David, it was interesting. I'm not sure if you heard Theresa Kong's views earlier. Basically, she said, it doesn't necessarily signal impending disaster, that Evergrande needs to decide what it wants to be when it grows up. Let me get your views. How serious is this situation?
Well, so the situation now, and the reason markets reacted quite badly on Thursday, with the stock, I think it was down 6%, the most since May, or the lowest level since May, is that, we were able to see a letter. It was dated August 24th, so about a month ago. And the letter was from the company. It sent it to the Guangdong government. And essentially, it was outlining a worst case scenario and mapping out what kind of situation that was. So I guess that's the first point. There was an incentive here from the company to obviously paint a fairly bleak picture in order for it to get what it wants, which is really support for a restructuring. So what's going to happen is there's a deadline, January 31st. That's when strategic investors are allowed to exit. Now, if it does get the restructuring, and part of that might lead to it being able to list, it then averts a cash crunch. If it doesn't happen, it might be facing $19 billion. That's a payment it needs to make to those investors, and that's about 90% of its cash. And that's really going to dry up its balance sheet. Now, the reason we're looking at this is because it's a very big developer, and obviously when you look at the reaction in the bond markets, and here you go with the drop in bonds yesterday, it's something to consider because this might be a similar situation which some, not all, developers might find themselves in. S&P yesterday revised its outlook to negative for the company's rating, so we'll see what happens today here.
So are the signs pointing to a systemic disaster here? What are the possible wider implications?
Part of the letter, Sherry, did talk about that. So if it does get to this situation where it needs to pay a certain amount of money, say a large amount of money, that could lead to, and I'm just going to look at the paper here, cross defaults. That's the term that they used here in its borrowing from banks, trusts. And this is where it goes from an issue specific to Evergrande. You have a deadline, you have investors to pay, you need to pay it by this time, to something that might have wider implications on the industry. What you're looking at on your screens is you're looking at dollar issuance, bond issuance in China already quite low. When you say debts, when you say Chinese debt issues, usually first thing that comes to mind is property developers. That's where you get a lot of the fundraising, a lot of the leverage, a lot of the net gearing on those balance sheets. It's specific to the industry. Is it a big issue? It hasn't been an issue. Will this trigger something? It could, which is why we're tracking not just what happens with Evergrande today, things like wider spreads, for example. And it's certainly, if you're sitting on debt, if you're sitting on bonds of Chinese developers, this news is what you do not need in your life.